Hi there. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're going to call primitive shapes. So you might have seen this meme floating around the internet before where it describes how to draw an owl by drawing two circles and then everything else with the owl. And it's meant as a joke about how tutorials and drawing guides especially can seem like they start off really simple, like you can do it, and then they get so insanely complicated. The funny thing about this joke is when you really start to get deeper into art, you realize there's actually a lot of truth to this because these two circles is actually the thing most people get wrong when they do art. Proportions, the big shapes, is the hardest thing to get, even though it's our first step. I think about it like playing chess. Knowing how to set up the pawns, they're the easiest unit to move, but it's actually one of the most complicated parts of the game. And for us, we think of a circle as a circle. But knowing the exact right proportions to be able to see an owl in these two shapes is part of what you need to learn to be a good artist. In fact, making these little feathers, drawing the little tufts on the horned owl's ears, it's not hard. I could teach you how to do it in an afternoon. It's sort of like if you learn how to draw a realistic human eye, you're like, it's easy, and I put it on journals everywhere. But then you try to draw a face and it looks terrible because you don't have the proportions right, because primary form is really, really important. It's so important that when most people start learning art in traditional forms, drawing and painting, like I did, you spend a lot of your time drawing still lifes, bowls of fruit. Bowls of fruit are great, even though you're boring, and you say, but I came into this art class because I want to make cool stuff. Why am I drawing bowls of fruit? Well, for one, they don't move. Their lighting is consistent, and for two, they're usually made of simple geometric shapes and trying to get you to see them and understand them in perspective. Much in the same way, when you're learning 3D modeling, you need to be able to mentally understand the core simple shapes behind everything. So these big, basic, primitive shapes that you've probably doodled before, spheres and cones and cubes, are understanding them is going to make you a better modeler. We call these primitives in 3D architecture, and it used to be that to generate these shapes, you had to make them by hand out of your own verts and edges, and in some cases, you had to literally piece them all together. Well, in this case, they save us some time. If you hit Shift-A in Blender, you can go to Meshes and choose a bunch of these different options. The most common ones you're going to be using are the plane, which is a flat object with no thickness or depth to it. A cube, which is probably the most commonly used primitive you're going to use. Most things are actually cubes in some way. We're not really, every now and again I use a circle, and then I'll very often use a UV sphere for certain elements, usually when I need something round. What I really need is the poles. So if I need something like a lollipop, instead of round from round, I'll use that. More often than not, I'll actually use a cube to make a round shape, something I'll show you how to do later. And then the next most common one I almost always use is a cylinder. So flat on the top and bottom, round on the sides. The other ones, toruses, cones, and even the little monkey head all have their uses, but more frequently than not, I'm using planes, I'm using cubes, I'm using UV spheres, and I'm using cylinders to make pretty much any shape that I want. Now, when we're learning how to draw, you learn how to break down complex objects into their simple shapes, and modeling is exactly the same way. Take these illustrations of trees. Very complicated shapes, but by turning them into big spheres and cones and cubes, we can start to understand their overall shape. And when we're modeling, we start with these big shapes too before we get more specific. So when you're learning how to draw, this is a credit from an excellent drawing YouTube channel, Proco, really goes over this idea of a camel looks complicated, but it's actually an assemblage of many of these primitive, simple shapes put together. And it's the same thing for modeling. A water bottle is actually just a cylinder with a couple extra loops through it. This clock radio is just a cube, and if I can get the cube to be the right proportions, the same. Something like this orange is a sphere, and this slice of an orange, well, it's a sphere I've cut in half and filled in the hole. These shapes, when rendered and textured properly, can perfectly describe what's going on. I'm going to show you a little example here. Let me pop out of this, and I'll open up my notes. I have a relatively complicated looking object, this car. But if we start to look a little closer, you'll see what we really have is a cylinder, and like more cylinders on top of cylinders. We have something like a sphere that's been cut, and then most of these other shapes are cubes. Another cube. Here's another cube. This here is a cube, just a really thin one. And oh, like this up here, this is just half a cylinder, just cut in half without the ends on it. And so as you start to look at a complicated shape, here's another cube. You start to realize they're built up of much, much smaller, much simpler kinds of shapes. So in the next video, I'll show you how we can actually use some of the modeling tools to get the shapes that we're looking for inside a Blender.